Welcome back to the Penn CLO Podcast. I am Emma Zumsen, and I am here today with Dr. Jess Jones, a recent graduate of the CLO program. And I am absolutely excited to be discussing her research on B2B sales and the intersection with psychological safety. Jess, welcome today.
Well, Emma, thank you so much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here to talk a little bit about psychological safety and its intersection in business to business sales. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So your research was really fascinating to me. In my line of work, I do a little bit of B2B sales, but mostly stand in reverence of those who have the background and that particular skill set. So it was really interesting to examine the topic from the lens you chose. And most research on psychological safety looks at team dynamics within an organization, people working together, building rhythm day to day. But you went in a totally different direction, which I found very interesting, studying salespeople and their customers in healthcare B2B sales. What drew you to that kind of unusual setting?
Yeah, I mean, talk about an unsafe space, right? If you had asked me, in the start of my career about sales, I probably would have described the guy in the plaid pants on the used car lot. And that was really my perspective of sales for a very long time. But as I grew in my professional career, it sounds like maybe somewhat similar to you, and sales became an expectation of the job. I did a lot of consulting work. And as you become an executive in consulting, you're expected to sell, you're expected to bring in new customers for the organization. And what I really recognized as I did that was something totally different than what I expected about sales. It was really about building trust with these customers, demonstrating my respect for their work, for their organization. And that really enabled this very strong cooperative relationship. And this is where psychological safety actually came in for me. So I think psychological safety gets a little bit of a bad rap sometimes. I'll post on psychological safety quite a bit on LinkedIn, and often I'll have somebody in the comments say, oh, psychological safety, it's a waste of time. We're not holding people accountable in psychological safety. We're letting them get away with anything. We don't expect them to work hard. And really, psychological safety is very simply about building trust with an individual and demonstrating respect for that individual. It is really that simple and also that complex, right? And what we recognize when we have these environments of psychological safety, where we've built that trust, where we've demonstrated that respect for that individual, we get some very desirable behaviors in the workplace. We see things like people are willing to speak up about very unique, sometimes even crazy ideas that lead to innovations. We see in very risky environments, people are willing to say, hey, you know what, we're in a very intense situation and I need to admit that I don't know something. I don't understand how this works. Or I need to stop you and say, hey, I think you're about to make an error. This comes up, for example, a lot in healthcare, which is my background, where it's essential that a nurse be able to speak up to a physician and say, hey, doctor, I actually don't think that's the right answer. And you need to have an environment where you're very comfortable there because people's lives are literally on the line. More recently, we're seeing some research in psychological safety related to all the mergers and acquisitions and partnerships that we see in the workplace today, where we're trying to get value between different organizations as they come together. And often these teams aren't all that interested in working together. And by creating psychological safety, we really enable them to cooperate effectively together. And so that is really what led me to get curious about, well, what does that look like? What does psychological safety really look like in sales? And how do we create it? And that's what the research was about.
That's fantastic. To pull a thread on one of the things you mentioned, that trust dynamic, so often we believe that is something that is initiated from the top down, but your research revealed something totally kind of counterintuitive to that, in that the less powerful person in the relationship can actually create psychological safety for the more powerful person. And you bring to life in some of the examples you share in your research, how visceral that dynamic can be. And it lends itself to this concept of small L leaders that you introduce. What does that term mean to you, and why does it matter when you're looking at this kind of dynamic?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking. I think we still sometimes have this idea of kind of traditional leadership, and I really think that doesn't exist as much anymore in the workplace. We really have kind of two kind of leaders. We have what I think of as the big L leaders, these people that have positional authority. They have that title that goes and backs up their leadership. But frankly, most of us, when we're working in the modern workplace today, whether or not we have that title, we have responsibilities, we have goals, and we need to collaborate and have people work with us to achieve those goals for the good of the organization. So we all have leadership responsibilities, whether or not we have this title. And traditionally, we talk about leaders and subordinates, and I really just don't love that term subordinates. I don't think it's really indicative of how we work in the modern workplace. So I started talking about this idea, and it's not my original idea. I want to be very clear about this idea of small L leaders, right? Where maybe we don't have that title, but we have leadership responsibilities. And what I found as I examined this in the context of salespeople and their customers, it was a very similar dynamic where the customer has this big L leader role. They have that positional authority. They get to say yes or no. Whereas the salesperson is more of that small L leader. They have a responsibility, they have goals, and they're trying to achieve this cooperation. And they have to do it in a way that enables this big L leader to work with them in a space that is very safe and comfortable for them. And that is really what made me recognize, hey, you don't actually have to be a big L leader to create this psychologically safe space. You can, in fact, do that as a small L leader for people that are in positional authority or for the peers that you work with every day.
Considering that stands in contradiction to some of that psychological safety theory that a lot of people in the leadership development space have deeply invested in and are investigating today, what kind of resistance or reaction have you encountered as you bring voice to this dynamic?
I will say really none. As I've talked to other individuals in the leadership development space, they actually get really excited about this. What many of them see, and what I see myself as well as someone who does a lot of leadership development with different organizations, is that we have this expectation of individuals. We want them to have a high level of responsibility, regardless of the title that we give to them. And in fact, many organizations, as they talk about the capabilities, the expectations, the competencies that they want to have for individuals in the work that they're doing, they talk about this concept often of managing up. This idea that I can manage upwards, that I can work with people that are in authority, whether that is in my organization or potentially a customer or a client that they're working with, and work with them effectively in moving forward, in sharing, cooperating, and achieving goals together. And it's absolutely essential that everyone that is doing this behave like that leader, that small L leader, and they have strategies that they can figure out, okay, how do I do this? How do I do this effectively so that we can achieve those shared goals?
One of the aspects of that cooperation or that accountability dynamic that you just spoke to that I myself have encountered, and even as I've digested your work, have found myself being more attentive to, is when you are in that small L leadership relationship and attempting to build that psychological safety, the cooperation becomes somewhat of an interpersonal risk. It's not the usual speaking up or admitting mistakes. How did that surface for you and the participants in your study as you were doing this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this was a really unexpected finding for me. So traditionally, when we talk about psychological safety, we talk about this idea of interpersonal risk. When you are in an environment of psychological safety, so you experience that trust, you feel that respect, you are willing to take risks. And a lot of times those risks, just like I described with healthcare, right? It's the nurse telling the physician, hey, I don't understand something. I can't do this effectively. Or telling them, hey, I think you're about to make a mistake. Those are the type of interpersonal risks that we talk about. But in this dynamic where you have the small L leader interacting with someone in that position of authority, or when you have the salesperson interacting with this customer as the individual in authority, what I realized is that person in authority, they actually don't view speaking up as much of an interpersonal risk. They're in authority. They kind of, in many ways, have told me in my research, I can kind of say what I want. I'm in authority, right? It's actually, I don't mind telling someone I don't know about something. I'm comfortable speaking up and sharing my ideas and my thoughts. That's not a risk for them. What was a risk as I started to talk with more and more of these executive customers in these business to business sales interactions was their willingness to cooperate with that small L leader, in this case, that person, that salesperson, and say, yes, I'm actually going to cooperate with you. I am going to put my role, my reputation behind the activities that we're doing together, and I'm going to support that cooperation. And I had some of them say, look, if that cooperation didn't go well, if I'd made a poor decision, I could really damage my reputation. I could even lose my job. So that cooperation actually became the interpersonal risk in a way that I didn't anticipate, but now recognize is a very powerful thing and a very powerful outcome that you get when you create this psychological safety, is that person being willing to cooperate with you, even though that's a risk to them.
There's so many parts of examining psychological safety within sales that, to me, have allowed development of psychological safety in non-sales environments to be thought of differently. I think no more for me than the aspect that you speak about regarding withholding psychological safety and the salesperson's need to kind of rise above and pretend and operate as though that does exist to continue with building the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
How do leaders, especially small L leaders, where they are in non-traditional power dynamics, navigate that without complete burnout and exhaustion?
It's interesting. I'm writing an article on this right now, and it's definitely it's a big topic, right? How do we manage psychological safety without that exhaustion? And there are a number of things that we can do related to just how we focus on the ultimate goals, what we're trying to achieve. But what was really interesting to me is one of the things that you just talked about there, Emma, is that you have to have this willingness. If you want to create psychological safety and you are not that person in authority, you actually have to have this willingness to be vulnerable first. So you have to behave like the psychological safety exists. And normally vulnerability is something we say comes out of the result of psychological safety. But if you want it as a small L leader, when you don't have that authority, you actually have to behave like it exists already and be a little vulnerable with that individual. And that becomes a part of that building trust component.
You spoke about vulnerability and some of the unexpected dynamics that have come to the surface in your research. So there's got to be a lot of new guidance or interesting actions that you've also discovered. How can somebody think about taking your findings and directly transpose them to their day-to-day work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So the vulnerability piece is one of them, right? That willingness to be a little vulnerable in your interactions, particularly when you're in that small L leader or, again, in my research as a salesperson. There are a few other things that came out of the research, though, that I think are really important. Now, the first one is going to surprise no one, and it's that aspect of trust. I'm going to say something maybe a little bit radical here, but trust is actually, I think, a very boring topic to talk about. What is really interesting to talk about, though, is the aspect of building trust. How do we do that? We talk about trust all day. We don't often sit down and say, well, what do we really do to build trust? And this was an incredibly important thing. 100% of the participants in my study talked about aspects of building trust as being absolutely essential in this creation of psychological safety. And when we build trust, we do it in a few different ways. In particular, when we're talking about this interaction between the salesperson and the customer, between the small L leader and the big L leader, one of these is credibility. we have to find a way to demonstrate credibility. We do this through demonstrating our expertise. We do this through being very honest. And most importantly, and not surprisingly, avoiding any misleading or dishonest behaviors. This was absolutely essential. And while it's obvious, I think people don't actually always think about that as much as they need to. Another one is we really need to be thinking about, what is the orientation of this other person? Do we really understand their needs and what they're trying to accomplish and what their motivations are? And then also, we need to demonstrate commitment, right? We're committed to being successful in concert with them, and people need to experience this. In fact, I think over 70% of the participants I spoke with said this idea of commitment was a really important aspect of building this trust between individuals or within teams. So that's one, trust building. The second one is this idea of cooperation, right? And how do we actually build cooperation? So it's really interesting. If you read research on cooperation, cooperation only exists if you think it's cooperative and I think it's cooperative. And what I will see a lot, particularly with salespeople, is they'll say, I'm trying to cooperate with this prospective customer, and they're just not cooperating back with me. What's wrong? And the answer is, you're not cooperating in a way that they value. So that is actually not cooperation. So you need to understand what is really important to them. And as I spoke with a number of the executive customers in my study, what they told me was, when you demonstrate that cooperation, you're also demonstrating respect for them, for their needs, for their organizational needs. So I actually refer to this a lot as respectful cooperation. And that's an incredibly important aspect of building this psychologically safe environment. And then the last one that came out is this idea that I call strategic patience. Now, it's not going to surprise anyone when we talk about building a relationship that it can take patience, right? But that patience isn't passive. We can't just kind of let it happen. It's actually very strategic. And as I've talked to people, that strategic building of the relationship starts with that very first interaction you have with an individual. Basically saying, hey, I am going to take the time to really listen, to really focus on them, to really make sure that after that first meeting, I am thoughtfully following up. If I say I'm going to do something, I've done it. If I see something that's going to be of interest to them, I'm letting them know about it. I'm even potentially, particularly in this salesperson customer dynamic, I'm willing to invest resources in their needs before they've invested anything back. So it may be I am sharing some of my expertise. I'm helping them to solve a problem, even if it's a problem that maybe my organization doesn't solve from a sales perspective, but I'm helping them figure out a solution, making those investments over time. So having that strategy of patiently building this relationship is absolutely essential.
What I find incredibly powerful about the framework that your study has created is that it encourages really thoughtful interpersonal relationships. That aspect of credibility, really being mindful of those signals to somebody that you understand their motives, their needs, and that you're not going to violate that trust, even with the little things. I think that is really significant. And I know, and I'm personally very excited, you have spent the better part of the last few years going very deep in the world of sales. But I think this framework that you've developed and these core principles have such broad reach and potential impact. Where are your interests carrying you next? What other areas have these dynamics that you're going to explore?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because I'm actually involved in a research study right now where I'm taking this research, this framework around things like trust building, respectful cooperation, strategic patience, vulnerability, and saying, how does that apply outside of just the salesperson customer relationship? And what does that look like in the workplace when we talk about these small L leader roles? Again, whether you're interacting with someone who's in a position of authority, your boss or your boss's boss, or you're interacting even with your peers who you also have absolutely no authority over, but may need to accomplish goals with. And this is early days. I'm still in my data analysis, so I want to be very careful here. But I will offer that I am finding that these aspects, this framework, is very applicable when we look at it outside of even the business to business sales realm. And we think about it in the context of just how we work with each other in the workplace. There are certainly some nuances. And again, I'll offer this is just a very early teaser into some of what I'm seeing. One is that aspect of credibility is kind of interesting. And it's very fortunate, I will offer, for people that are doing this with others in their workplace is because you work within the same organization, what I'm finding is that people are usually willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when it comes to your credibility. They're going to assume you come with that level of expertise. They're going to assume that you're going to be fairly honest with them. So that's really great news within the aspect of trust building. But it does also mean that aspect in particular of that other orientation, understanding what that other individual really needs, what they're trying to accomplish in the organization is that much more important. So that's one interesting aspect that is a nuance to it. And then the other one I'll share that is an interesting nuance is related to that aspect of strategic patience, where I'm finding it is still absolutely essential from that very first meeting that you think about that other individual and think about how you want to build that relationship. But fortunately, for most people, if they work within the same organization, what I'm finding is that patience doesn't take as long. When I spoke with executive salespeople and executive customers in my study, that patience could take months, it could take years sometimes to really build that relationship. And what I'm finding in my study now as I talk to people who work in the same organization is you can actually build that relationship much more quickly in a matter of weeks or months as opposed to months and years. So that's just a really quick preview of my research and what's coming out there. And I'm really excited to finish up that study and share more about that because just like you said, Emma, I have a lot of people asking me, hey, how can I take this into my workplace? I don't do sales, but I see how this is applicable to what I'm being asked to do every day. And I'm really excited to help people with that.
Yeah. And I think the actionability of the principles is what is so phenomenal about the framework. I am very excited to see what you learn and how you continue to deepen the definitions in ways that people can think about applying this and carrying this through at work. And I think well beyond that, if I may say. So if there's one thing that you would want somebody to take away from your research or this conversation, what would that one thing be as they think about small L or big L leader? How should they be thinking about influence based on what you've learned?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up that word influence because it's the one that I talk about a lot. Again, because this is very relevant to sales, but it is relevant more broadly to this idea of how do I create influence when I don't have authority? And if I were to offer just one thing, I would say it is to be very strategic and very thoughtful about it. Don't just assume these things are going to happen. I think a lot of us just assume, hey, I'm just going to do me and everybody else will just kind of rally around that. And that's not the reality because we all have a lot of things that are happening around us. We all have different goals and different motivations. And so to really take that time to get to know the individuals around you, and most importantly, do it with the right motivation. Don't do it with the goal of, I want to manipulate someone. Do it with the motivation of, I want to help that person. I want to help us accomplish a goal, not me accomplish a goal. So I will just end with that. Have the right motivation in the way you employ these strategies. You'll be successful.
I love it. Jess, thank you so much for the work, for the steady focus in this area. I think it is going to help a large number of people. So excited to see the continued research you produce.
Emma, thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.